So one of the big topics in linguistics is prescriptivism versus descriptivism.
Mhm.
And well, maybe you could elaborate a bit on that.
So I guess um, you could um, try and go to the Latin on this. Uh, to, although I'm not actually sure I can do that. But anyway, so the distinction is that I guess prescriptivism is probably maybe what more people think of
Mm-hmm.
on the sort of outside of linguistics,
Mm-hmm.
as it were, that it might be about, because sadly, the most contact that most people have with any sort of linguistics is like English teachers,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or I guess, sort of native language teachers
Mm-hmm.
in schools, laying down the law about, this is the way you have to write, you can't
Mm-hmm.
write this, or,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you can't pronounce words in that way, and so forth. And that's prescriptivism,
Mm-hmm.
as in sort of saying that ascribing some sort
Mm-hmm.
of moral value to certain sort of ways of speaking, ways of writing,
Mm-hmm.
choices of word, pronunciation,
Mm-hmm.
accent,
Mm-hmm.
all these sort of features of language, which, we see,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
vary so widely even within a single language.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, um, whereas sort of linguistics, as we know it, sets itself up to be a sort of the scientific study of language.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so in that context, there's not really any place for prescriptivism. The idea is to observe the variation that there is as closely as possible and as much detail as possible, and to describe it, and then probably try and make sense of like what's sort of going on underneath. But the initial step is to observe rather than to,
Mm-hmm.
in a sort of neutral way, rather than to um, sort of observe in a judging way, which is
Mm-hmm.
the attitude of a prescriptivist.
Hmm. Yeah, I think one of the easiest ways to understand this concept is that, in the same way that a doctor will prescribe something, in the sense that they say, you must do this because I'm telling you to do so. Mm.
Yeah.
Whereas descriptivism comes from, the fact that I'm going to describe what I see, and I'm not going to say that this is wrong and this is right. And I think it might be worth our time giving some examples, maybe from English, of descriptivism versus prescriptivism. So if
Hmm.
an English speaker were to say, I need to think about it, as opposed to I
Hmm.
need to think about it. Now, I'm just going to go
Yeah.
close to my camera for a second. I need to think about it.
Yeah.
I need to think about it. So, I mean, we're not going to get too complicated in describing the terms, but those two different sounds, from the prescriptivist perspective, what would somebody say about I need to think about it?
Well, they would say that that's wrong.
Hmm. And let me play devil's advocate for a second. What's wrong
Uh,
about it? Tell me why it's wrong. I'm saying, it's perfectly okay for me to do this, and let's say that you're the prescriptivist, and I'm going to say no, that's just the way I speak.
mhm. So you're actually making me
Yeah,
play devil's
yeah. I'd like
advocate.
if you could please.
um, so I would say that, your your friends might speak like that, your family might speak like that, but if you want to speak properly, you can't speak like that. And yeah, I guess that's the sort of the basic level,
Mm.
and then you might sort of add some sort of further sort of moralizing layers on top of that. But you know, basically, it's yeah,
I
it's
think
a
you're
thing
right.
about social prestige.
Exactly, like this kind of speaking properly, like there's a proper way to speak, there's like the correct way, and all other ways
Yes,
are to be avoided. For example, in Spanish, aiga, as opposed to aya.
yeah,
And for example, if you have a Spanish speaker who says, para que ya no haya más problemas, instead of para que ya no haya más problemas. I mean, at the end of the day, do you believe that these two sentences have the same function?
Yes, I mean, and these sort of things, like the problem, I think prescriptivists sometimes try to make the argument that that people won't understand, or that there's these sort of forms of speech that they don't like are sort of less clear or something like that. But the in the majority of cases, right, like that Spanish example, no one's going to misunderstand what's meant.
Yeah.
And so I guess the question then arises from that, like, is the point of language to convey meaning, or is it to sort of, or is it to as a sort of social status symbol? And I suppose the point is that it can be both, but it's only as well, I mean, I suppose linguists are interested in studying the ways in which people sort of signal status and their sort of social aspirations through how they use language. But in terms of the point is that again, that's an object of study, not an object of like judgment.
I wonder if there's some sort of connection between written language and prescriptivism. Because, I mean, let's be honest, language as a human phenomenon is not really all that new in human history. However, writing and orthographic systems or some pictorial, symbolic, whatever representation is relatively new. And in the same way, children are not taught to speak. I mean, they it's kind of like part of them, right? But we actively sit children down and teach them how to write. So would it be fair to say that writing is firstly not so much a part of human nature as speaking is? And secondly, is there a connection between writing and prescriptivism?
Well, answer to the first question, I suppose. I mean, there are still there's still a very large number of societies in the world without a written tradition, and yet they can have, very rich oral literatures. So, yes, in that sense, writing is clearly not an essential thing for very very sophisticated use of language. And then the connection between writing and prescriptivism, I suppose you've got to be careful. Not, I guess there's no necessary connection. Like, I suppose you'd probably say that sort of France and the UK, for example, are probably equally literate societies, yet France, with the Académie Française, for with its dictionary and its grammar and so forth, seems like a sort of, on the face of things, a more prescriptive sort of society, sort of country, at least sort of on the official level with regard to language, whereas the English-speaking world seems a bit sort of more relaxed about that, at least on the sort of at the high level. But I suppose writing can lead you to sort of relate to language in a different way, and that it's sort of there in black and white and sort of fixed. Writing gives this impression that sort of language is something out there that you have to like a sort of a tradition or sort of rules that you have to follow, and that sort of, when we're speaking to each other or writing to each other, that there's this sort of example that we have to follow. So it's sort of prescriptivism puts things, the the wrong way round in that
Mhm.
sense, sort of historically, that
Mhm.
it sort of puts writing as a sort of a
Mhm. Yep.
prior thing, an example to follow, whereas in fact, writing
Mhm.
follows the example of written
Absolutely.
language.
Absolutely, from its origin.
Um,
I mean, the
yeah.
reason why I asked the question is because when you think about spelling, I mean,
Mm,
growing up in the UK, we had
yeah.
spelling tests. You know,
Yeah.
and I think the idea of like, this is the correct spelling and this is the wrong spelling. And there's kind of like,
Mm,
I mean, we know that's not really the case. I mean, you think about variations in spelling, between America and the UK, right? I mean,
no.
color, flower, etc., etc., etc. I mean, not so much within the Spanish language, but some people will write Mexico with a J, some people write with an X. Pretty much in Mexico, it's universally with an X. But I mean, in other parts of the Spanish-speaking world, and there are historical reasons for that. And it's funny because people kind of get quite upset about it. But I think the idea of this is the right way to spell it, in a
Mm,
way, is too easily transferred. Well, if this is the right way to spell it, then there's also a right way to say it and a right way
yeah.
to pronounce it. And by implication, if there's a right way, there's also a wrong way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Would you give us an example of something like think and think, or I don't know, in English, the one I gave in Spanish about aiga? Would you give us an example from Russian or French, or maybe even Latin or something?
Uh, well, so um, in French, um, let me see. Uh, so um, a change that's occurring in French at the moment, which sort of the story of which goes back a long way, is negation. So anyone who's learned French will be like familiar with this concept of like the negative sandwich. I think we were
Ne
taught it as. So like in English you say uh, you know uh, does not
Mm,
plus the verb, whereas in French you have these sort of two elements to make the negation, but they go around the verb. um, and so the sort of in the basic case it's ne and pas. So
yeah.
if you say je ne vais pas,
Mhm,
uh, and that means I don't go. So it's the ne and the pas.
mhm,
And so historically, the sort of the negative comes from the ne,
mhm,
um, like in Spanish, no, and that was all that was necessary. And then this pas is
mhm,
actually means step,
mhm,
um, in Old French, and then so there was this sort of set of words that came to be used in conjunction with ne,
mm,
um, for negation. So rien
mhm,
and jamais and
mhm,
so forth. And so these are all like sort of negative adverbs.
mhm,
Um, and you have to use a different one depending on whether you're saying never or
mhm,
nothing
mhm,
or no one
mhm,
or um, and so you can kind of see where this is going, maybe that actually the sort of the negative meaning has increasingly got attached to those words,
mhm,
because like those are the ones that are more noticeable. Those are the
mhm,
ones that are changed depending on what sort of
mm,
negation you're making.
mm,
And so people are increasingly dropping the ne
mm.
and just saying je vais pas
Yeah,
or
yeah.
something like that. And
Like
so that's something
the
that
classroom French.
prescriptivists wouldn't like.
Yeah,
Um,
the classic classroom French. Je ne sais pas. What would that
yeah,
come?
that would be je sais pas.
Right.
But then once you've got the je and the the c
Mm.
close together, then they sort of get mushed and you say ruche or something like that.
Interesting.
So then you get further.
Hmm.
So then that's a sort of slightly different.
Yeah.
thing, but that's also something that prescriptivists wouldn't like, this sort of, fudging the words together in that way.
Right. So, yeah, the kind of the realm of prescriptivism goes beyond just spelling and pronunciation. It also gets into grammatical questions. I believe that prescriptivism is really prevalent in all levels of the language. They tell you how you should pronounce it and how you should structure your sentence and how you should. And if you don't do it like that, you're wrong. Now, is modern linguistics concerned with prescriptivism? Is that what we do? Is that the job of the linguist, to go around and correct people and say them, don't say I ain't got no money. You have to say I don't have any money. Is that what we should do as linguists? Go around the country, go around the world, and correct people so they learn to speak in some prescribed way?
No. No. I suppose we want to, I guess the way we've been talking about prescriptivists, they might seem like some sort of evil people who have to be sort of like fought off at all costs. But I guess you should, like, I know, hate the sin but love the sinner. But yeah, no, if someone speaks in a way that seems a bit different, or you've not heard before, as a linguist, the response has to be, oh, how interesting. I wonder what's going on there, rather than, that's weird, or that must be wrong, or whatever. So
more a reaction of,
I guess
it's
of
more a reaction
curiosity.
of curiosity, right? Like, oh, I haven't heard that before. Oh, that's different. That's new. That's unusual for me. And
Yeah.
like kind of, oh, that's intriguing. I'd like to know more. I wonder why that's happening. Yeah. Rather than a judgmental, you shouldn't do that. You're a bad person.
Yeah. And I suppose sort of the sort of tragedy with prescriptivism is that we've already, at this point, even 50 years ago or more, when people were really, seriously getting interested in doing this kind of work, it was too late for a lot of language varieties and even languages wholesale. There are languages that are dead because and irretrievable because prescriptivists or mixed often with some sort of form of colonialism come along and said, you can't speak like that, you're going to speak like us.
One of the clearest examples of that is in Franco's Spain. Before Franco came along, there was huge linguistic variety, and languages such as Valencian or Galician were kind of on an, or maybe not on an equal par, but they weren't too far socially speaking, on like so much of a lower social rung than Castilian was. And he came along and said, you guys on the periphery of the Iberian Peninsula, you speak wrong. And you can't speak like that anymore. You have to speak Castilian. Yeah, and he prohibited these languages and persecuted their speakers and blah blah blah. And yeah, you're right. I mean, the number of languages which have, like you say, are completely irretrievable because of, like you say, prescriptivism mixed with colonialism. Like, I speak better than you, therefore you have to speak like me if you want to be civilized, if you want to be a proper human being, if blah 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 blah. In what way is I mean, maybe I'm a hypocrite, because when I work with second language learners, when I work with second language learners, I correct them. So in that sense, am I being prescriptivist when I say, don't say, let's say, she don't like football? You have to, she doesn't like football because it's third person singular, blah blah blah. So am I a hypocrite?
That's a tricky one. So I suppose that's where this sort of moral dimension comes in, I suppose, that like prescriptivists are generally not, their targets aren't really second language learners, right? It's more about, there are these sort of first language varieties or features of first language varieties that they don't like for whatever reason. So yeah, but that's not to say that it's not useful to know how people are going to expect you to speak, because people, whether consciously or not, will perceive you differently if you're not sort of, depending on whether you are or aren't following the norms. And yeah, so I guess it shouldn't sort of take that element of identity away from language, that every time you open your mouth, you're signaling something about your identity. And
I mean, because for
that's
example,
a big object of study in itself.
yeah.
Um,
If you go into a job interview and you, let's say rather than the number of people who have participated, you say the amount of people. Yeah. Now, it may be the case that the interviewer doesn't pick up on that or whatever, or maybe the interviewer does pick up on that, has studied traditional grammar, and then may perceive you as less educated.
Yeah. So I suppose that the point is that, like, prescriptivists are usually telling people who know that stuff, like, most people who are targeted by prescriptivists, it's not like they don't know the right way to speak. That's just not the way they speak. Most people can sort of switch between varieties if they want to. It's just whereas I suppose with second language learners, the concern is more that, like, they're not aware of the differences in how people will perceive you, depending on how you speak.
I'm not sure if I completely agree with that last part you mentioned about the native speaker, because I don't know, I have no data or no evidence to suggest this, but lots of people that I know may not be able to explain the difference between less and fewer, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's not on the level of being able to give a sort of theoretical explanation of what's going on, but I think they'll be aware on some level that, like, that there are these differences. And what I'm thinking of mainly is, like, second language English speakers I've come across who, I guess it's particularly a thing with sort of mixing elements of British and American English, and people, I think, it's very easy if you've sort of probably got a lot of American English on the TV, and then you come to the UK and you acquire sort of British sort of phrases or turns of phrase to be like, it's all English. Whereas to a British person or an American person, it sort of sounds like this sort of slightly strange mixture of things. And it's not like, it's not like we sort of, it's wrong or it's not English. It's just like, most English speakers are like a sort of, they speak in a British way or they speak in an American way. They don't, or as examples, they don't speak in this sort of halfway between sort of way. So I guess that's the sort of, example I really had in mind, where a British or American speaker would hear this thing and say, oh, that sounds rather British, or that sounds rather American, whereas the second language speaker might not be aware of that sort of distinction, and therefore how they're going to be perceived.
So
but whether that sort of generalizes, I'm not sure.
Let's switch this. Let's kind of flip this situation on its head. So let's say that I'm in a Spanish grammar class and I'm the student, and I say something like, "Ayer comiste eso." yeah, as opposed to the standard ayer comiste eso, right? Now, the language teacher is in a tricky position. And I think I think the best language teachers would take the following approach. They would say something like, that is a feature of the Spanish language. People do that. It's not considered correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, as in, so so that's different from what a prescriptivist would do. Right. That's
right. The prescriptivist would say, hey, that's wrong. What are you doing? That's wrong. That's bad. You will probably go to hell because of this very fact. But the good language, you say, that's I must warn you, that's a non-standard feature. Yes, people do it. Yeah. But I must warn you that maybe in a job interview, you may be perceived as less educated, or something like that, and that could have an effect on you. And then the decision is up to you, right? Now, a moment ago, you mentioned what's the word? Correct me if I'm wrong. L'Académie Française, is that the one?
Yeah, l'Académie Française.
I'm sorry. And in Spanish,
you're perfectly entitled to say it that way. I just warn you that may be perceived as a less educated.
Seriously? Are you winding me up?
Well, because you said français, right? So that's like the masculine form, whereas l'académie is feminine, so it has to be française.
I beg your pardon. No, but I mean that's a that's
an example of.
But a native French speaker would never make that mistake.
I guess that's another thing that I sort of wanted to say. Yeah, that there are sort of things that learners say that like native speakers never say.
Correct. No matter what reason, age, identity.
Yeah. So there are things that are sort of outside any level of native language variation.
Definitely.
And I guess so in that sense, those still aren't like wrong. They're just not English as it has been observed or as it's sort of spoken anywhere natively.
Exactly.
But I guess with the sort of, I guess we're seeing with English specifically as it sort of becomes spoken by more and more people, the sort of the scope of what is and isn't English gets quite fuzzy, and that's a very interesting thing in itself. But
and you're right. It's easy to say that English in its purest embodiment or its purest form or something like that is contained within the native speakers, but that's simply not true, because now we have global English, and lots of English is spoken between non-native speakers. So, for example, when somebody from Spain communicates with somebody from Taiwan, in all likelihood they're going to be speaking English, right? And it's definitely the case that English is not the kind of exclusive preserve of people from New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, India to some extent, Scotland, blah 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 blah. Very, very interesting. Now, the reason we kind of sidetracked there is because I wanted to mention La Real Academia Española, and I think that's one of the classic cases where most language speakers kind of revert to La Real Academia as some sort of authority, and they definitely feel themselves that they have authority, but I wonder where they think they've got that authority from. They feel that they're in a position to say this is wrong and this is right, and they even now have this diccionario de dudas. So like these things, like they haven't decided if it's wrong or right. I'll let you know. I'll tell you next week if what you're saying is wrong or right. I just need to have a think about it. Like and people kind of think like, I think one of the kind of most interesting things about learning linguistics is kind of taking the authority away from these organizations. I don't want to use the word authorities. Taking the authority away from them and saying, well, actually, the language exists in the minds of the speakers. It's not like, people say, is that even a real word? I say, I'll look it up. I'll look it up in the dictionary. Well, if you can use that word and that word is understood by you, that word has completed its function. That's what it's there for. That's why it's in your mind. The essence of a language is not, if I don't find it in the dictionary, that word doesn't even exist. You just made it up. Well, I'm sorry, but the word Facebook didn't exist, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago. The word guitar didn't exist before guitars existed, but nobody is ever kind of questioning the fact that, oh, is guitar a real word? I mean, maybe they were when, you know, guitars were a relatively new thing. I mean, do you think that language bodies, I'm going to use the word bodies, such as La Real Academia Española, do they have authority? Should we reference them? Should we check what they say to see if we're right, to see if we're wrong?
Well, I suppose just first I want to say, like, the example of Scrabble, right there, it's the opposite way around, that there are words in the dictionary that no one ever knew, no one ever uses, and hardly anyone knows what they mean.
Right.
So in that sense, and that's maybe a way into your question, in that the sort of the documents produced by institutions like that, they're not without value or not without interest. As in, you know, if people see there are words that have been, I mean, we were saying before about, you know, sort of things that have been lost due to prescriptivism, but also, you know, we do have records of all these words that no one uses anymore because they're there in the dictionary, and someone at some point decided that it was worthwhile writing them down and saying what they meant. So yeah, but that's and I suppose if you really have no idea what a word means when it's used in context, or you see it in a book or something like that, then a dictionary is a, you know, such as one produced by one of those institutions, is a way in. But yeah, as you know, descriptivists, we have to say that usage takes precedence.
I know exactly what you mean. And in what way is the English language different? Because I mean, we have language bodies. We have the Oxford English Dictionary. In what way is the Oxford English Dictionary? How is their approach different? Is it different?
I don't know a huge amount about how it's compiled and, you know, continued and so forth, but I think the OED sort of doesn't position itself in the same way as the dictionaries produced by l'Académie Française or the Real Academia or whatever position themselves. You know, it is a more linguistic approach in that sense, that they still have sort of certain, I think, slightly vague and probably questionable criteria about which words to include, which words not to include, and so forth. Like, you know, if you're in the UK or maybe the English-speaking world more generally, like there's, you know, they update it every year or few years, sort of in a major way, and there's always a sort of news story about these are the words that are entering the OED and so forth, and it's kind of an opportunity for a reflection on, you know, sort of modern trends, you know, or events over the last
because I think
few years.
I think people feel that if a word is found in a dictionary, like for example, selfie, you know, oh, it's in the dictionary now. I mean, my personal reaction is, I don't care. I mean, the like whether or not that word is in the dictionary kind of is, in my view, is irrelevant to the descriptivist. Or maybe not, because maybe like what was once the realm of the descriptivist has now become prescriptivism, or maybe has now been given some sort of, like, I don't know, stamp of correctness or some sort of seal of, I don't know,
approval,
or valid language
acceptance.
use, acceptance, exactly, some sort of like validation. But I think the descriptivist takes more the attitude of, well, people were using the word selfie, maybe not long before it was in the dictionary, but definitely before it was in the dictionary. I think people sometimes forget that the dictionary is the reflection of the usage, not the thing that tells us how to use it. Because if, I mean, it's like this chicken and egg situation. But in the case of linguistics, we know the answer. First, it was the language in the minds, in the mouth, in the ears, speakers. Then came the dictionary, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm just wondering actually whether the study of the way that foreign languages are studied isn't partially to blame for this, in that when we're learning a foreign language, there are so many words that we come across. We don't know how they translate into our language. There are so many words in our language we want to be able to use in the foreign language. And so we sort of develop this dependence on dictionaries in that context.
Yeah.
And so maybe some of, and that's a very sort of natural and,
Yep. I mean,
natural thing to do, because you can't, it's not practical to wait for these words to come up in conversation. You go to a dictionary. And so I wonder whether some of the sort of prestige of monolingual dictionaries as opposed to bilingual dictionaries that we would use when studying a foreign language doesn't come from that, that encounter that people have with them at school.
I mean, because I mean, in those cases, the dictionaries are extremely useful. I mean, it's like you need the dictionary, and you find the words like, oh, great, this is fantastic. It's like, little by little, I can learn to speak this foreign language. So maybe the usefulness of the foreign language dictionary or the bilingual dictionary kind of rubs off onto La Real Academia or the OED.
Yeah, and I suppose we probably shouldn't underestimate the extent, like just, yes, from a sort of descriptivist point of view, there's no limit to the number of words in English, right? We don't know. That's not really an interesting question from a descriptivist point of view, or not one that people really study. Whereas, in the OED, there is a definite number of words, and I guess what I'm trying to say is that number of words is extremely large. So, like, there are words that, tens of thousands of words in dictionaries that no English speaker will ever hear or ever know the meaning of, or that any given English speaker will never know or never hear or never know the meaning of. And so that sort of dictionaries have that purpose in case you sort of come across one. I mean, like, oh, I wonder. And then there are these sort of words in the middle where probably most people have heard them, but don't have a particularly clear idea of exactly what they mean. And in that case, the sort of dictionary gives you an idea of how they're used, particularly ones like the OED, where they will actually give an actual example taken from a sort of real life use of language.
Exactly.
So I suppose there's this sort of, what I'm trying to say is there's this sort of spectrum of words in terms of how commonly they're used, and the more commonly a word is used, the less reliable a dictionary is for telling you like what it actually means in terms of how people use it, because it will be more subject. It's like the development of irregular verbs, or irregular noun paradigms or whatever, right? If you look across languages, the most irregular verbs are the most frequently used verbs in many cases. And I think the same applies on the level of meaning. Like, the more a word is used, not only is its form likely to change, but its meaning as well. And so, yeah, I suppose then the danger is sort of not recognizing that and sort of treating a dictionary as an authority on all sort of
Planes.
levels of in all the sort of in all those sort of levels of how often a word is used. Whereas they were, I think, at least in the sort of English tradition, dictionaries started as a sort of like kind of even just a list, but then they sort of cottoned on to the idea of definitions as well. But these were words that people were unlikely to have come across. There was like difficult words. And then it sort of got expanded into a more sort of all-encompassing endeavor to lay down the meanings of all words. But that's a sort of like a never-ending task.
Absolutely.
And
And
yeah.
one